So everybody, welcome to Leading with Empathy and Allyship. Here we have deep, real conversations about how we can be more inclusive leaders in our workplaces and communities. I'm Melinda Briana Epler, the founder and CEO of Change Catalyst and your host. At Change Catalyst, we build inclusive innovation through training, consulting, and events. And this is a safe space to learn, to build empathy for each other, and to understand tangible actions we can all take to be better humans, better allies, and better people in our workplaces and our communities. So today we have Sonja Gittens Ottley, Senior Research Associate. Oh, I'm sorry, that is not right. I copied and pasted incorrectly. Sonja, I'm so sorry. Sonja is the head of diversity and inclusion at Asana. And we'll be discussing how to expand and deepen our anti-racist allyship today. Welcome, friend.
Thank you so much, Melinda. I'm so excited to be here with you on podcast number 41 and excited to have this discussion with you.
Awesome. Me too. Me too. So something I wanted to start doing regularly, Sonja, if you'll join me, let's describe ourselves for our listening audience, anyone who's blind or low vision in the live show, and anybody who's listening to the podcast as well. So I'll go first. I'm a white woman with long red hair. It's a little longer in COVID, wearing a turquoise shirt and white and black glasses.
I am a Black woman with glasses and headphones, and I'm wearing a blue sweater and black inner top. You may be hearing an accent, and that's because I am not a citizen of the United States. I'm an immigrant to this country from the Caribbean. Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you. So on screen, we have ASL interpreters. Thank you to Interpreter Now for our ongoing partnership. This is also being live captioned by White Coat Captioning. Maggie at White Coat Captioning is captioning away. So if you want to turn on captioning, just go down to the bottom of your screen, click on closed caption. You might have 3 dots where you have to click more and then close caption, and you can adjust the settings there as well. And our team, Renzo, Sally, Juliette, Ariyah, Emilie, Darlene, are all behind the scenes doing amazing things and appreciate them. They're also in the chat and Q&A. So if you have questions, please ask away there. And then if you have specific questions for us, Sonja and I, to answer, please put them in the Q&A so we can get to them easily. And yeah, please, as always, share what you're learning, share your aha moments, share anything that's coming to mind along the way. It definitely helps us in conversation. So a little bit of background on kind of why we chose this topic today. So many people are new to allyship since George Floyd was murdered last year. And we've been talking for a year, almost a year, about being anti-racist, but have been focused on black and white. But racism is not just black and white. And often our work of learning, our work of taking action is on behalf of one community. And that's okay. And that's okay. But the hope is that we continue to learn and expand our work. In this episode, we're going to talk more about expansion, about how we work to address other forms of racism, for example, and to address intersectionality.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Sonja, could we start just by you telling a bit about your story and how you came to do the work you're doing today?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm an immigrant to the United States, and I started my career as a lawyer. I had originally started working with a company called Yahoo, and I really focused on public policy work, really the intersection of business and human rights, and really how companies like Yahoo or any tech companies were building products and how people were using them. And it really became clear that the ways that companies were developing products was really different from how people were actually using them, implementing them in the field. And our products were being built by people who had really limited perspectives. They weren't bad perspectives, but they weren't informed by the actual users. So the builders did not reflect the users. And my work really started in thinking, how are we creating spaces where the builders reflect the users, people who have had different experiences, people who understand how these products might be used in different countries, in different communities, the impact of communities on how products are shaped. There's so much to happen there that ultimately leads to a richness of a product. And in doing that work, it really became clear that we need to get people inside companies who reflected our realities, reflected our communities, reflected what we were trying to build. So that was my pivot from public policy work into diversity and inclusion work. So it started off thinking about this in terms of representation, but you cannot do one without the other. You have to be thinking about when people are in an organization, how are you creating a space where they can be exactly who they need to be so that they can do their best work, right? So that they can thrive. And you have to also recognize that people are coming from different places and people have not had all the access to opportunity. They absolutely have the potential, they absolutely have the skills, but they have not had the access to opportunities that others have had. So how are we creating space to allow and ensure that there's equitable access to those opportunities, recognizing that a lot of what we've built and a lot of what we've thought about has not provided for that. So that's how I've been always thinking about my work, ensuring that there's it's not just around diversity, it's not just around inclusion, it has to be arm in arm. And over all of that, you have to be thinking about that sense of equity and fairness.
Awesome. So can you talk a little bit about, let's define anti-racism and
Sure.
what does that look like for you?
Sure. The reality is racism is embedded in all of these structures that exist in the societies that we live in. It's embedded in our media. It's embedded in education. It's embedded in the workplace, in our systems of law enforcement, our systems of justice. Systemic racism exists and it's embedded in all of those areas. And you have to be continually working towards equality for all races, for all groups, and striving to undo racism in your mind, in your personal environment, in society. So for me, being anti-racist is really having this really active and conscious commitment to fight racism wherever you're finding it, because it exists, it is there, it is pervasive. And to really kind of destructure it and decouple it from yourself, as well as from all those other places. It's a very intentional commitment. It's work that we all have to be doing. So I really think about it as, if we are anti-racist, we are actively doing work to dismantle racism wherever it exists.
Awesome. And how does that play out in your work as a DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner? How does that work? How does that play out in the work, in the way you think about your work?
I think it's core to how you think about your work as a professional, and it's specifically around really continuously evaluating our systems, our policies, our practices, the workplace, the culture that is building, that is being built, to ensure that they're not upholding those systemic biases, that systemic racism. So it's, what are the policies that exist that allow for hiring? And that's just an example. What are the interview practices that you have? How might they be contributing to these behaviors and these biases? What's the evaluation, the performance evaluation process that you have? What's the policies that you have around harassment, around microaggression, around discrimination? All of those things, evaluating, auditing, ensuring that those policies in and of themselves are not upholding those sorts of systemic biases and racism that exist. So that's how the work shows up in terms of really building policies and behaviors and practices that really contribute to creating that workplace that is both diverse and inclusive.
Got it. Yeah. Can you also talk about just how you think about it in your own life?
I love that question, because I think that's the easiest part of it, right? The easiest part of it, in my mind, is really ensuring that you're developing a sense of empathy, really understanding how am I understanding what someone else is going through? How am I really standing in someone else's shoes and understanding the challenges that they have faced, the challenges that they might be facing, and developing that sense of empathy and understanding. Everyone has to do this work. I have to understand how this shows up for me? What blind spots might I have? What microaggressions might I be sort of exhibiting that I'm not even aware of? And there's simple, small actions that I think of that really kind of gets to that. I spoke about systemic racism and how it's pervasive and how it exists in all of these structures. And an action to kind of think about to kind of counteract that is, who am I reading? Who am I listening to? What media am I consuming? Who are the thought leaders that I follow and learn from? Are they just of one type of identity? Am I really trying to really follow and learn and engage with folks that come from so many different places and really kind of understanding that work and the work and what's happening in various communities? But also the other part of it is doing some introspection and understanding how might I have benefited from some of these systems. Particularly as a Black woman, it really means kind of recognizing how I might have internalized this. And that's hard work. That's hard to think about it in terms of, whoa, because it's easy to say, well, I'm a Black woman, so I do get it. Do I? Really spending that time to understand both that internalization as well as how has that impacted my relationships with other groups? Again, racism is pervasive. It creeps into everything that you're doing, and being anti-racist really is around actively counteracting all of that, learning some behaviors or unlearning behaviors that you've had, and doing that introspection and reflection. So that's why I say it's the easiest, hardest work, because it's so obvious, but it still requires a lot of awareness and reflection.
Yeah, it's kind of obvious and not obvious, and because it is been normalized, right? And
yes,
and so we have to actively open ourselves up to see it and to understand it. Yeah, and
absolutely.
learn about it. Yeah,
Absolutely. It's difficult, but I think it's probably the most rewarding, because you're doing the work that makes the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we were talking about as we were discussing what we wanted to talk about for this episode, this is what you really wanted to talk about, was how do we expand this, expanding anti-racism work. Can you talk about why that's important to you?
Yeah, I feel that the idea of expanding this work is how we get everyone both to a shared understanding of this is what's been happening. This is the impact it has had, not just on our society, but on our workplace, on our culture. This is how it's impacted how our communities are engaging with each other. And I think really expanding the work of anti-racism is the thing that shifts the needle, that really has the impact around what we are all trying to do when we talk about diversity and inclusion. Really creating that space of shared understanding of, oh, these are the structures that we exist in. We need to collectively dismantle them. We need to collectively counteract these behaviors. It literally requires everyone to do it. I talk a lot at Asana about a team of everyone approach, that this work, D&I work, is not work that can be done by one person. Everyone needs to understand it, and everyone has a role to play so that it can have impact. And having everyone come to that shared understanding creates workplaces that lead to truly creating a sense of belonging for all, and really get into a space where people understand it's not only about correcting the wrongs that have happened to the Black community, but by doing this work, it ultimately benefits everyone, because doing this work well requires us to look at ourselves and look at these structures that have unfairly harmed all of our communities. And that's why, to me, expanding that notion is where we get to actually drive forward impact on D&I, because everyone is doing this, and everyone has a role to play around it.
Yeah, and just kind of thinking about our own journeys, maybe we could talk about it a little bit. And I was just thinking, you know, about my journey and allyship and anti-racism and discovery and kind of learning about this and then taking action. It's actually started, I started probably not, I started a long time ago when I was in college, when I was first year at college, and thinking about this. And my first kind of moment of awareness was thinking about racism, anti-Black racism, and then you know, as those doors opened in my brain and kind of knowledge and understanding, I quickly also understood how racism affects Indigenous people and then other groups as well, other ethnic, in terms of race and ethnicity. Right. And then I kind of expanded beyond that to also thinking about people who were third gender, non-binary, trans, and eventually women, and eventually then after that, people with disabilities. So it took me a long time to kind of get there. So yeah, I think, you know, most of us, I just want to, you know, if you're in this place, if anybody else is in this place who's listening, you know, it's okay to start with one group and then kind of expand from there. Sonja, what has your experience been?
Yeah, I think it is exactly like that. And the thing is that journey of learning, I think, is so important. I had a conversation with someone yesterday who was saying, who was pointing out, you know, as a Black woman, she felt that she would understand it. And we were talking about it in the context of the recent attacks against the Asian community. And she mentioned that she felt she would be able to articulate and be an ally to colleagues, and that she was struggling with it. And it was around that sense of, it's something that you all have to learn. We're all entering it at different places. And for me, it truly started when I moved to the US. I migrated here close on 17 years ago. And really shifting into a place where, and I came from a country where I was part of the majority, and shifting into a place where I was questioned on the basis of my appearance, my skin color, or my accent, and becoming a parent really kind of brought home to me that notion that how I viewed myself was not how people viewed me. And so that was my first shift. And then really kind of reflecting on the privileges that I had in my original community, and that I did not have those privileges, and thinking about that in the context of who else was this happening to, right? And understanding that work of, oh, this is not a space. This is a space where I need to demand more, and I need to demand more on behalf of others as well. And it's often easy to start to think about it in terms of the communities that you're most adjacent to. So for me, it was around immigrants, but then it started to expand into, but what about these groups and these groups? And really, and it's still a journey. There are still times when you think, well, first of all, I would step back and say that you always have to be learning. You always have to be challenging yourself on what are you missing? What are you assuming that you are aware of, right? And how is that showing up? And I think particularly for professionals in this space, you have to approach it in a way that allows you both to prioritize or to center the groups that are under most harm at a particular moment, but also with the lens of centering, as well as how can I expand this or even scale it, if we want to use a kind of businessy term. How can you scale it to use that opportunity to think about this particular group and to take action in support of a particular group to allow you to impact other groups? So for me, it's as for everyone else, I think it's a really personal journey, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed with it. But it's the kind of work that is so ultimately fulfilling and allows you to really to grow as a person, and to be, as you said at the start, if you're being a human, you have to do this work, because for the time that we're all on this planet, we need to be thinking of everyone. So that's how I've approached it. And I would say I'm very much a work in progress where this is concerned, but it's work that I think is absolutely necessary if I want to keep doing this work well.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody's got it all down perfectly.
Yeah.
We're all work in progress. And part of it is we're all collectively learning too. Language is always changing, and kind of identity politics and how people describe themselves is always changing. How people see themselves is always changing. And in part because we're taking action and moving things forward. Might be not fast enough, but it is changing. So I think just kind of thinking about where we are in this moment in time, and a lot of work has been, a lot of action has been taken around anti-Black racism and kind of addressing that in companies. And I will say that in our consulting work, there've been an awful lot of inbound companies looking for, how do we do anti-racist work, when they're specifically looking at how to create change for Black people and on behalf of Black people, which we then respond, that's awesome. And we need to do that. And also, there is this bigger picture as well. And I think that's kind of what we're getting at here too. And now there's rightfully so a lot of work being done on anti-Asian racism and violence, but it's more than the violence, it's the microaggressions and the other harm that is created as well. So how do we kind of think about, I like what you said about scaling our action to multiple, to encompass multiple groups. I think that is so important. As we're doing this work, we can be addressing the specific needs in this moment, and also building for a future where we're dismantling racism for everyone.
Exactly. And I think, and that's the beauty of the work. Asana, for example, when last year, we came up with 11 initiatives that we felt would encompass our work against racism, our acts against racism. And some of them were expansion of new policies or programs. No, let me rephrase that slightly to be clearer. Some of them were expansions of existing programs, and some of them were net new programs or policies. But as I look at those programs and policies, we crafted them specifically to be anti-racist. So some of the work really encompasses all of the communities. A few of them are specifically supporting and centering the Black community. But ultimately, I think we had recognized that we needed to think about anti-racist as how I've described it, as even though in this moment we are talking about Black and white, ultimately, to do this work well, we need to be thinking about all the communities and these structures that exist, these programs. How are these programs correcting those imbalances and that injustice? But you're right. And I expect that within the last maybe 2 months or so, I'm certain that a lot of organizations, as you mentioned, got inbound requests looking specifically at how do we counteract this work to support the Asian community, right? And I think that is, I say yes and, meaning that when we think of it like that, we become reactive and we miss the opportunity to think about this in terms of how are we solving the fundamental problems? How are we getting to the fundamental solutions? How are we thinking about microaggressions generally? And the onus is on all of us to be talking about it in terms of these things are happening to this community, and we absolutely need to be focused on fixing them for this community. But you need to understand that this is happening to many communities. And I think it's a balance that a lot of us struggle with, which is we absolutely want to center and ensure that we protect the community that the spotlight is shining on. But how do we at the same time balance the needs of all our communities? And part of it is really doing the work to dismantle those underlying systems, right? And it never feels as though we have enough time to take a breath and do that work. But I think it's so imperative for us to do it, else we'll always just be trying to solve in a very spotty way when we need to be fixing some fundamental challenges that we're having.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, in terms of time, there's two ways to look at it. One is, yeah, sure, it takes time, and if you do it now, and your focus is on, how do you dismantle the systems with Asians in mind, and then are you going to do it again when when something else comes up, or are you going to take it all into context and say, okay, we need to focus on this, and we need to focus on this, and together, if we do that, we will fundamentally dismantle the systems, rebuild them rebuild them in a way that is as close to completely anti-racist as we can.
Exactly, and I think, and that's the opportunity I think that we continue to have, right? I'll use the example of what's the content that we're consuming, right? How are we understanding the issues? It should not have taken these incidents for so many people to understand that anti-Asian rhetoric and attacks against the Asian community were on the rise and have been on the rise since the start of the pandemic, right? More people should have been aware of that. And certainly people within the community were aware, or if you were following activists or you were involved with community organizations, you were aware. But more people should have been aware of that. And there's an opportunity for us as humans to ensure that we're plugged in, that we know what's happening in the society, that we know what's happening to people that we work with, to our peers, to our friends, that we're able to have those conversations so that when a major incident happens, we are not left thinking, what should I say? How can I address this? We should already be plugged in and know that Stop AAPI Hate has been a thing for more than a month, or that Black Lives Matter did not just start last year, right? We should be more aware of these things, and there are always opportunities for us to be plugged in, particularly if we want to really think about being an ally to any other community other than ourselves.
Yeah, so can you talk about some practical things that people can do in their workplaces? How would you, how do you advise folks at Asana to really engage as allies and really work on their anti-racism?
Yeah, it's always difficult within a workplace because you're asking people to do all of these work-related things, and on top of that, think about their people. And that to me is the nugget, because you're asking them to think about their people. And so so that's my first response. We're asking you to think about your people because they're part of your team. And how are you creating a space where they know that they are supported so they can do their best work? So I say that in the context of that to me is really crucial to doing this work well, really creating that space. The other thing that I would say is recognizing that within a workplace, people have different entry points. Some people might be plugged into what's happening outside of the workplace, might be plugged into what's happening in various communities. Some people might have just heard the term allyship within the last 6 months, right? It's really new to them. So I think within the workplace, part of it is kind of setting a tone and example around these are the things that are happening, and these are the things that you should be aware of. These are the things that are important to your team members or teammates. And then creating a space, and that's one of the things that we do at Asana, is really encouraging leaders to check in with people. And I say that not as a, hey, I'm going to check in with you because something is happening in your community, which feels frankly inauthentic and might just not be what the person is looking for. But creating a space that says, I know that a lot might be happening, and I want you to know that if you want to talk about it, there's an open door. And if you don't, that's also okay. So
Mhm.
just kind of creating that place where people can opt into having those conversations if they want to. Having leaders kind of develop that allyship muscle so that we have this philosophy around taking care, taking action, and taking responsibility. And taking care is encouraging folks who come from any community that is not just marginalized, but also facing attacks or under attack, encouraging people to take care of themselves, and encouraging leaders to remind folks to take care of themselves. So encouraging them to, whether it's taking time away from work, using mental health resources that we have, really being able to take the time that they need to ultimately feel safe. And then we encourage, we have employee resource groups where we really position them as a space for the community, as well as a space for allies to learn more about the communities and the issues that are important to them. So allies can come and learn more about the issues. It's not a place where it's the only place that they can learn, but it's a space to learn more about the perspectives of fellow employees or fellow Asanas. And then really thinking about it in terms of having resources that they can then opt into, for the resources on what allyship looks like, things that they can say, learnings that they can have, language not to use, language to use, like really kind of giving them tools. I really like to say or to think that I don't think you can be trained to be an ally. I think you have to practice allyship. And it's something that you're going to be always practicing and learning on and reflecting. So doing that work to understand your role, becoming aware of the issues, and then creating spaces to learn. Are some of the ways that we've kind of encouraged leaders and teammates to do this work, but there are always opportunities for us to do more.
Yeah. So if you're an ally or an advocate or an activist or DI practitioner, how do you move people along the path to expand the work of allyship? How do you get people, often women, for example, or most of us are focused on our own identities first and then kind of move outward from there. How do you get people to expand?
Yeah, I think it goes right back to creating different entry points, like recognizing that people are going to be at different stages in their journey. Leaning on that sense of empathy and awareness. So building that awareness and education on being able to look outside of your own lens and understanding more about the community that you exist in and the society you exist in. One of the things that we do at Asana, for example, is we host a Real Talk series, which is internal facing. And the idea behind it is that you're hearing perspectives from fellow Asanas, so fellow employees, or not fellow, other Asanas who are members of the community or who are sharing their perspectives. So they're not speaking on behalf of the entire community. They're sharing their perspectives as a member of a specific community. And the idea behind it is that it's often honest and uncomfortable conversations. We've had conversations around being Black in tech, being a Muslim in America after the 2016 election, being biracial, being an immigrant, coming out in tech. The idea behind it is that it allows you to learn from other Asanas and how they are dealing with other issues outside of the workplace and how it may impact or may not impact how they show up in the workplace. But it also requires you to do some reflection on what else might I be missing? What other stories am I unaware of? And how does knowing this and having this additional knowledge affect and impact how I interact with my colleagues? I think it's a really powerful way for people to learn more, to build that sense of empathy and awareness. And it's an entry point into, now that you know this, what are you going to do with that information? How are you going to learn more about these communities? So really providing and creating points where people learn more, build that sense of awareness and empathy, and then shift into action. How are you going to contribute to making this place, whether it's a workplace or your community, better now that you have this knowledge? So I think that's how we kind of move folks along the path, really, really thinking about recognizing where people are, and sometimes not just creating different entry points, but also using it to expand and to meet them where they are so that you can kind of bring them along into the journey of allyship, because it is a journey and a practice.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Everybody, we're going to switch to Q&A in a little bit. So if you have questions, please, for Sonja or I, please put them in the Q&A function. I see one already pop up. So please put your questions there. So how do you address, especially now, but always, I think in this moment, it has been really hard for a lot of folks in so many ways. I mean, so many things are happening in people's lives right now in this moment. And how do you address fatigue? How do you keep people motivated to do this work?
Yeah, fatigue and burnout is real. I think everyone is feeling it, right?
Mm-hmm.
We did at Asana, we did an anatomy of work report where we surveyed 13,000 people, and 7 out of 10 folks are experiencing this. And within the work of DNI, I feel as though it's happening even more. And the first thing I say is that looking away doesn't remove what's happening, or being tired of it, right? Doesn't change the fact that it's there, that we're dealing with a lot of things, and it's never ending. There are a couple of things, that idea of taking care first and foremost, like really taking care of yourself, because this is very much a marathon. It's not a sprint. The wins, if they can even be termed wins, are incremental. And I think even taking a moment to celebrate those incremental wins is important. Really recognizing these small victories. In March of last year, did you think that so many people would be talking about anti-racism?
Mm-mm. No.
I think that's a victory. I think that's a victory. That's a win, right? That we've shifted the conversation front and center into anti-racism and into doing work that is anti-racist. So that's one thing. I'd say being clear on what we're trying to accomplish is one of the ways that you kind of both keep motivated as well as kind of have a North Star. Like, what are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to achieve? While you're in the work, it's hard to see the progress, but often others can see it on your behalf. Or you can, if you have the luxury of stepping away and looking at it, you can say, wow, we were able to do these things. So really kind of honing in on the small wins, having a support network allows support to know that you're not the only one going through this, and talking about it makes a huge difference. But really, I do think taking care and celebrating those incremental wins is super important.
Yeah. Agreed. And I will say for me, I have definitely over the last year I've burnt out a couple of times and had to, recuperate. It's
Right.
really important. It's really important to find those moments. Yeah.
It is. And I think back to even when you think of tech inclusion, right? And the growth of tech inclusion. And I'm sure when you were doing like the conferences and looking at it, it's like, oh, this feels like a lot of work and are people engaged. And then you look back and you're like, wow, look at the communities that evolved as a result of that work that we did, and the conversations that folks are having, and the networks that were built because of those programs, right? And I think that's the value of it right there. That's the wins right there.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know what she's talking about, we Change Catalyst built the first Tech Inclusion Conference back in 2015. We started thinking about it in 2014. It was one of those things where we thought it was going to be a one-off conference, right? We thought we were going to have one once, kind of wash our hands of it and keep going. And we did it for another 6 years, right? And it is, yeah, you're absolutely right. And you don't know in that moment just what those ripple effects will be, and how it will fundamentally change the way people do things, think about things, collaborate together, etc. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and that is a piece of allyship, is you don't always know. You don't always know what your impact is going to be. Yeah. So, kind of looking at the practical things to dismantle the system, so to rethink systems internally in the workplace. I know, you and I have talked about using inclusive design principles to rethink how we address racism, and kind of, can you talk a little bit about what you do internally to get at the deep work that is needed?
Sure. I think, inclusive design principles are ripe for working with DEI work, and really around addressing racism. So just for context, using those principles allows you to kind of focus on people, focus on growth mindsets. So it's very people oriented, and it really looks for different or innovative solutions to problems that are very complex. So that lines up squarely with racism. And I think using those key principles, empathy, empathizing, which I've spoken about a couple of times here, really around starting it off with empathy, learning more about the issues and challenges, understanding it from the perspective of those in the community that you're trying to solve for. Defining, really defining the right problems. Are we trying to define the right problem? And I think with last year, as I mentioned, there was a collective recognition for us to go beyond being not racist, right, to being collectively anti-racist. So the problem we were trying to solve shifted, right? It's not just about changing some behaviors and training people in terms of, which is still valuable, training people to understand how bias shows up. That's a part of it, yeah. But it's when you shift into this idea of anti-racism, it's how is this showing up in different structures, and what are the things that we need to do to correct these systems and structures. So it's not just about being able to recognize it and mitigate it, but this system is ultimately based on bias. In terms of if we think about, for example, some of the interviewing practices that existed in some companies, this system is based on bias. How do we make sure that we're creating a fair and equitable interviewing process that ensures or disrupts bias, right?
Right.
So and then the next step is really around really ideating. What are the solutions that you're coming up with that solve that problem now that you've identified the correct problem? And of course, the rest of it, really just testing it and piloting it. Is it right? Is this the right system? And then iterating. How are you kind of measuring and improving, or measuring the right things so that you can then improve it, right? So for us, for example, we are doing allyship sessions and allyship workshops with our communities. And we're really focused on, based on the work that we've done and using those principles, how are we creating a system that allows people, it's not a training, to understand and reflect and really be aware of how allyship benefits everyone, how being an ally ultimately allows your team to thrive and do their best work. So shifting and contributes to creating systems that are disruptive of the existing systems. So we're in, I would call us in testing or piloting stage, meaning that we're rolling it out to our managers and really hoping that we can measure how is this really changing behaviors and changing expectations. But it's great to think about these big problems like this, because it allows you to really kind of develop the right solutions that you can kind of iterate on and ensure that they're meeting the needs that you've identified. So I just think really, really using them and applying that sort of thinking to any problem you're solving within or trying to solve within DEI. I think that to me is it's the way of the future.
Awesome. I'm going to jump into a question here from Francisca. How do we address the anti-racist terminology when in many companies it sparks a negative emotion and a feeling that something has been done wrong? So approaching from the point of view that everybody feels they can participate, so people don't feel like they're called racist for participating.
Mm-hmm. I think part of that is, well, a couple of things. One is asking people to enter into a space where they will feel uncomfortable, where they may feel called out, and also reflecting on why. Why do you feel called out about this? Why does this kind of elicit that kind of negative reaction? So there's a balance, right? There's a balance between creating a space where you want to meet people where they're at, but you also want to address some of these critical things. You're asking, I cannot emphasize how you're trying to ask people to dismantle behaviors and expectations. So really, I do think it's kind of calling them in to participate. Call them in and recognize that and even setting parameters for how you're going to have a discussion is so important. I encourage people to be really clear that this space is a term that is used a lot, but it is so necessary. This space is a safe space. You may have questions that you think are not good questions, or that they might indicate some of your own feelings. That's okay. Share them. We want to create a space where we can move forward so that you're not paralyzed by these fears. You're not paralyzed by that defensiveness. You can move through it. But you're going to have to do some work to unpack the why of it. Why are you feeling this way and why are you having that reaction? And some of that work, particularly as practitioners, we can't do for you. You have to do that for yourself. So I do think kind of setting that framework and giving those guidelines and continuously reminding folks of those guidelines, because you want to get everyone in so that you can all move forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I'm also kind of thinking that there is something to be said for, there is something that has been done wrong, right? And it's all our jobs to kind of counter it, to fix it, and to create that change. And so I think it's okay to acknowledge that, for the systems that we have created in our workplaces, just we messed up. We didn't create them with everybody in mind, and now we're working to change that, and we need everybody to change that. And so I think it is kind of calling people in, but also acknowledging that their mistakes have been made in the past, and we're working to make a better future together. And that, sure. I mean, I agree with you that that everybody has to do their own work, and kind of, if you feel like you're being called racist when you're coming to a workshop around anti-racism, then there is something in you that you need to kind of investigate and figure out, well, why am I feeling that way? I agree with you. Absolutely. And there are some, I think, when we feel something like that, there may be some truth to that, and working through that is really important as a part of this. Like, I look back at my past, and by being naive and thinking in my teens that we were in a post-racial society, that was wrong, and it's really important to acknowledge that in ourselves, forgive ourselves for it, so that we can move forward, right? And so we can work to create change together.
Yeah, because I do think I do think that fear of moving forward kind of stops us from moving forward, I should say. That fear of, am I racist for thinking this, or am I racist for saying this, or I said this thing and I can never come back from it, right? So therefore I can't move forward and I do nothing. I think that that fear actually is what kind of harms this work, because the shift has to be, oh, this is how I feel about this. Oh, I did this thing. That was wrong. What do I do next?
Right.
What do I action next? Right? It can absolutely stop you from moving forward. But that, I think, is where the work happens, when you recognize it. And then you're like, okay, now what do I do? How do I address this thing? Are there folks I need to correct it with? Maybe not. But if not, what am I going to do to ensure that that does not happen again? And I've heard so many people say, well, I'm not racist because I've done this thing, but now I've done this one thing and you say I'm racist. The action, the behavior is racist. There's always an opportunity for you to change that. Now, if you keep doing it, that's a different conversation. But I'm calling out this action and this behavior. Now it's up to you to learn from it and correct it. And I think creating that space where we allow people to learn from it and correct it, and for them to do that work to correct it as well, is very important. I think we've often created a space for people to apologize, but we've not held them accountable on the what next. What's the behavior that you're going to do going forward? And I think, and that's in not just in workplaces, but in society, right? Like, how do we ensure that people are doing that work continuously is really important. That's doing this work well. And it comes right back to it's work that we are all required to do. It's not just one group. It's all of us have to do some of this introspection and reflection on how it might be showing up for us in different ways, and taking that action.
Yeah. And you know, this is hard stuff sometimes. But once you kind of work on that yourself and kind of work past it, work on it, and then work past it, and take that continued action forward, to repair, to acknowledge, and to continue to take action to make things better. You become a better ally, because now you're recognizing when other people are doing it as well. You can say, hey, you know, I did that too, and here's what I learned. And that makes for a great ally, right? That's it
does.
You know, that's how we kind of collectively work together to create change.
Yeah, I love that, because you said repair, acknowledge, action. I love that kind of framing of it. And also, particularly when you've been in those shoes, right? And giving that grace and having that sense of empathy of, oh, this might be what or the challenge you're facing. Let me help you through it. And the reality is that it's labor. It's emotional labor. So it comes right back to making sure that you're kind of setting the right boundaries for yourself. You don't have to be the ally, helping all the other allies along, but you can certainly provide the tools that allow them to be better allies. And I think that's important as well.
Yeah, awesome. Well, we're out of time. Thank you, Sonja. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you, Melinda. I'm so glad to have been on. This is great.
Yeah. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for doing this work of change. And my question to you is, how will you expand your work of anti-racist allyship? How will you expand your work of anti-racist allyship? And what will you do differently? So join us each week, and please share this with your colleagues. You can find previous episodes at changecatalyst.co/allyship series. I know there was a question in the chat earlier. Also, an ask, please find this episode on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube and like it, subscribe to it. That definitely helps us grow our audience as well. And with that, see you all next week. Thank you again, Sonja. Good to see you.
Thank you.